Welcome to meeting number 132 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. I'd like to remind all participants of the following points. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. All comments should be addressed through the chair. And members, please raise your hands if you wish to speak, whether participating in person or via Zoom. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can. Ms. O'Connell, you had your hand up?
Thank you, Chair. I don't want to interrupt proceedings, so I hope we can take care of this very quickly off the top. But I would like at this time to move my motion that the committee summon Mayor Patrick Brown to testify alone for no less than 2 hours on the study of Indian interference, and that he appears before Tuesday, December 10th, 2024. So just quickly speaking to that, Mr. Chair, like I said, we have spoken about this before. This notice has been on the record for quite some time. I don't want to take away from our important witnesses and testimony, but because we have discussed this previously, I think it's important that we complete this motion in order to be able to invite this witness or summons this witness and get him scheduled so we can continue with this. So hopefully we can handle this quickly, and I would like a recorded vote.
So we have a motion on the floor. Ms. Tancho?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just reviewing some of this. Looking at the past witnesses that have been summoned, for example, Ms. Lauren Chen, certainly, Mr. Chair, she seemed to be certain by the indictment of receiver of $10 million from Russia Today to further Russian propaganda. So that seemed quite severe. We saw Christian Firth certainly was summoned and ultimately looked to have been defrauding the taxpayer for millions of dollars. I'm not aware if we're accusing Mr. Brown of any wrongdoing. I'm not familiar if we are, if the Liberal members are or not. But it would just seem that this is quite a significant sledgehammer of a tool to use on someone who I don't believe is being accused of anything. So certainly we agree with inviting him to committee. That's why we voted in favor of that. But to use a summons, I'm not sure, Mr. Chair, perhaps you can consult with the clerk. Has a summons been used in this way? I'm just not very clear on that. So it would seem from our perspective that this is quite an abuse of this tool in this regard, given my knowledge certainly of those who have been summoned. So those are my opening comments, Mr. Chair, and I would appreciate if you can provide a response to that.
So I'm being told that an invitation was given to Mr. Brown, and he declined. Alternative dates were provided, and there was no reply. So that's why I think this motion is perhaps before us. Mr. Genuis, no? Mr. Sarai, I have you next on the list.
Thank you. I think having sat as chair and justice, I think there is a precedent once somebody has refused to testify. If the committee so wills, they can subpoena the person. And it's not to say that they're wrongdoing. It's a matter of getting the witness here. If the committee so decides that it's very important and vital to have that person as a witness, I don't think this committee really decides, or any committees decide, if somebody's guilty of anything. It's an investigative tool and a reporting tool. So never is the guilt the reason to subpoena somebody. It's to have them here and respond. And as Parliament is paramount, I think it's very important that people respond to that and take that very seriously. And if they don't respond in another matter, I think subpoena is an appropriate method.
Thank you, Mr. Sarai. I have Mr. Uppal as the next speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just as a matter of, maybe it's a point of order or maybe more of a request, that we do have witnesses here who have traveled to be here. And I do understand that just recently our last witness has decided not to come from the rescheduling. So we do have time at the end of this meeting to address this issue. So if we can just put this off till after the witnesses are done, then we can address this as well. We'll respect the witnesses and their time, and also this committee's time, if we were just to deal with this issue, this motion, after the witnesses.
Ms. Dancho.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I would just like to underline that I think this is quite disproportionate given he's not being accused of anything. We're not sure why there's such aggressive action from the Liberals. I wonder perhaps Mr. Brown is just guilty of being a member of the Conservative Party and running for leadership and they wish to punish him. Seems to be that way. Certainly this is politically motivated. That's very clear. But regardless, it just seems very disproportionate to use this kind of tool. And we don't support that, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Okay. So I hear those comments, but we do have a motion on the floor, and I have no one else on the speaking order. So we'll move to a vote on the motion then. Okay.
Ms. O'Connell,
Yes.
Ms. Damoff,
Yes.
Ms. Groh,
Yes.
Mr. Shaw,
Yes.
Mr. Sorai,
Yes.
Ms. Denshaw,
No.
Mr. Juniors,
No.
Mr. Shipley,
No.
Mr. Matz,
No.
Madame Michaud,
En faveur.
Mr. McGregor.
Yes.
So yeas, yes, 7, 7, nays, contre, 4, 4.
So the motion passes. A summons will be sent to Mr. Patrick Brown. Okay. Great. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted on October 22nd, 2024, the committee resumes its study of electoral interference and criminal activities in Canada from agents of the Government of India. I'd like to now welcome our witnesses for the first hour. As an individual, Mr. Ward, PD Alcock, and from the Sikh Federation of Canada, Prabjot Singh, Legal Counsel. I now invite Mr. Alcock to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I don't actually have an opening statement, but let me, just for the benefit of the committee, since usually I'm introduced as the former director of CSIS, it might be useful for the members of the committee to know a little more about my background. I was, prior to becoming the director of CSIS, the senior lawyer in the Privy Council office for 10 years, and during that period of 4 years, I was the deputy clerk of the Privy Council and as coordinator for security and intelligence, which is the old title of the National Security Advisor. That title was changed after 9/11 as a consequence, in part because our colleagues to the south never knew what a deputy clerk was, and so they were never sure who they were talking to. But that change was made post 9/11. After that, I had after CSIS, I had several national security related posts, but they're not particularly relevant to this hearing, I assume. But I'd be happy to answer any questions that any of the members have.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Alcock. So a notice is sent before the committee convenes, obviously, with the names of the witnesses appearing. My hope is that members do look at the witnesses appearing and their bios. I now invite Mr. Singh to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes. Mr. Singh?
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the unceded, occupied territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg people. And as a settler here, I'm grateful to the generations that have taken care of this land for thousands of years. Over the past year and a half, particularly, we've heard a lot about Indian foreign interference and transnational repression. As legal counsel for Sikh organizations at the Foreign Interference Commission, I had the opportunity to review government and intelligence documents and cross-examine witnesses across a broad spectrum of government officials. Reviewing that evidence and hearing that testimony, one thing is unequivocally clear, that India is in a category of its own in terms of its corrosive and violent actions in Canada. India has no equal or no peer in this regard. For years, India has misused its diplomatic and state resources to directly target the Sikh community in Canada with the specific objective of criminalizing political advocacy for an independent Sikh homeland, Khalistan, and marginalizing Sikhs from all parts of public life, regardless of their political opinion. To achieve this objective, we've seen evidence of India discrediting party leaders using materials drafted by Indian intelligence, interference in the leadership race of the Conservative Party, the use of proxies to influence the issues that are raised in Parliament itself, cognitive warfare and disinformation tactics that demonize the Sikh community, while also manipulating public narratives about political differences to reframe them as sectarian conflicts. And one of the most subtle tactics is how India misuses its own security agencies, judiciary, and diplomatic staff to provide a cover of legality in its persecution of Sikh activists. So given this reality and events over the past year and a half, it's important to acknowledge that Canada's security and intelligence community failed to detect the extent of India's activities until after the assassination of a pillar of our community. And this is despite the experiences and complaints of the community for years before this attack. The lack of public transparency and decisive action to combat Indian foreign interference in Canada until after it was already too late appears as though it's largely related to the fact that foreign policy considerations were given greater weight by Canadian decision makers than the long-term domestic harms caused by foreign interference. And this is something that's been echoed and reported by the NZCOP as well. Media reporting regarding NZCOP's 2019 annual report in particular suggests that officials consciously redacted every single mention of India throughout the entire report, effectively not only hiding the significance of the threat, but even the existence of a threat from India itself. That report actually details, according to media reporting, that the government chose not to dismantle an Indian intelligence network due to foreign policy priorities, to export pulses to India, and particularly to ensure the success of the Prime Minister's trip to India in 2018. This de facto impunity, which was granted to Indian diplomats and intelligence operatives, appears to have emboldened Indian officials to escalate their operations in this country, which ultimately paved the way for the assassination of Shahid Bhai Hardeep Singh Nijjar in June 2023. So there's work to do before this committee and across government to address vulnerabilities in Canada's capacity to detect and monitor Indian disinformation, to put an end to the abuse of redactions to hide threats from the public inappropriately, and make meaningful changes to ensure that Canada doesn't allow foreign policy priorities to dictate the response to foreign interference. But it's also important to note that this is an institutional problem across successive Canadian governments which have failed to address this issue year after year after year. And the Sikh community has paid the ultimate price for this. Despite the violence and the threats our community has faced, our community members remain resolute and steadfast. We've faced persecution, massacres, genocides throughout our entire history simply for existing. And India's targeting of our community today is simply the latest iteration of that. So our community will continue advocating for justice and engaging in its right to advocate for a sovereign Khalistan, standing up to tyrants and pursuing justice for all oppressed peoples all around the world, no matter what the cost. And Shahid Bhai Hardeep Singh is a testament to that fact. So the question and the work before the committee today is whether all parties that are sitting around this table can demonstrate the commitment not to allow our community to be used as a bargaining chip by India, and demonstrate the courage not only to call out India's actions unequivocally, but to actually hold them accountable and make sure that there are consequences for the violence they've inflicted. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Singh. I will now open the floor to questions. I have first Mr. Opal for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. We'll start with the legal counsel for Sikh organizations for Sikh Federation Canada. Prabjot Singh, thank you for being here. Obviously, from what you're outlining, there's a very, very serious situation with foreign interference from India. I know we heard from the RCMP cases of intimidation, a lot of it to the Sikh community, violence, extortion, assassination, and attempts on a number of other lives as well. The Prime Minister admitted that for a number of years that they have known about foreign interference from India, and yet they failed to take action. They failed, frankly, to protect Canadians from that foreign interference. One thing I want to start off asking about is that we have seen a significant amount of misinformation coming from India. We saw a lot of this during the farmers' protest that happened a couple of years ago. We saw this again, maybe most recently, with some of the unfortunate instances that we saw in Brampton. Have you tracked or seen this information? And what have you seen the government's response, the Canadian government's response on this disinformation coming from India?
So I think on that disinformation issue and foreign interference more broadly, as I outlined, that this is an institutional issue that's plagued successive governments for the last 40 years. There's been evidence on the record in public media reporting and other government documents that India has been engaging in foreign interference and that there has been some degree of awareness of those activities in this country. As you pointed out, the question of disinformation is particularly dangerous, not only because India's disinformation kind of bolsters racist stereotypes about Sikhs and trying to paint the entire community as extremists and terrorists, but it is also targeting Canadian institutions all across the board. And Weldon Epp, who's the ADM for Indo-Pacific, has noted that India has a massive potential to engage in this kind of disinformation activity. When you talked about the farmers' protest in particular, during that period, the rapid response mechanism that's housed in global affairs had started operating around that time, and it noted that India was engaging in significant activity that was targeting Canadian officials, government officials, and the Sikh community in particular. And I think one issue, in addition to this narrative of Sikhs are extremists or terrorists, there is a concerted effort by Indian actors to paint a political difference around issues of political rights in Punjab as a sectarian conflict. So the RRM did actually observe in 2021 that pro-BJP outlets were trying to manufacture and amplify a narrative of tension between the Hindu and Sikh community in the country, and that there was some degree of insecurity. Earlier this year, in March 2024, CSIS has actually provided a high-level security briefing where they talk about the fact that India engages in foreign interference, particularly with its Hindu nationalist agenda kind of at the forefront. And one of their objectives is to actually target and marginalize Sikhs from political life in Canada altogether. So the impacts of this foreign disinformation and this kind of interference is not only in terms of electoral interference, but it has corrosive impacts on social cohesion by trying to paint sectarian conflict in Canada where it doesn't actually exist. In terms of the government's capacity, in terms of that rapid response mechanism, one of the most shocking things is that in 2021, by the RRM's own account, its analysts and its employees and those involved in that project didn't actually have familiarity with non-Western media ecosystems like India, and it noted particularly that this makes Canada vulnerable to Indian disinformation and the amplification of those kinds of messages. So there's a lack of familiarity. There was an acknowledgement that that was the case. The mechanisms or methodology particularly concentrated on mainstream messages or political leaders, not actually trying to differentiate how is Indian disinformation targeting the community or acting in Canada particularly. So there's a methodology that's clearly ineffective. There's a lack of familiarity. And to my understanding, as of the spring of this year, there's nobody within the rapid response mechanism that even speaks Punjabi or Hindi, which is the language of choice of Indian disinformation. And even broader than that, even within civil society, the Media Ecosystem Observatory, which is an academic resource to monitor disinformation, also doesn't have those resources. So we're looking at a country with a juggernaut of a media apparatus and social media capacities that is specifically and aggressively targeting Canada, and it doesn't look like Canada really has any mechanisms or capacity to monitor, understand, analyze, and actually counter that disinformation.
Thank you for that. I just want to get back into something that you had said that about the redaction of documents that clearly took out any notable incidents of Indian foreign interference out of those documents. Can you elaborate a little bit more about why you think that that was the case and why that happened? And obviously that that alone would have at that time helped to protect Canadians further, but that was taken out and no action was taken because of it.
I think from the community's perspective, it's particularly shocking because, as I said at the outset, it's not only that the gravity of the threat was hidden consciously from the community and from the public, it was the existence of this threat and how it operates in the first place. So we've talked about how foreign interference by India has been happening for decades. In 2018, after the Prime Minister's trip to India, NZCOP actually published a special report that was meant to look into allegations of disinformation, particularly by David Jean at that time, who was the National Security and Intelligence Advisor. That report was meant to be a transparent mechanism to talk about and deal with the national security and intelligence issues. In 2018, that report talks about Indian intelligence targeting Canadian officials with disinformation to pressure the government to take law enforcement and security actions against Sikh activists in this country, based off of that disinformation. That report is significantly redacted and doesn't actually divulge very much detail about the nature of that disinformation campaign, and it doesn't appear that there was any assessment into the potential efficacy of that disinformation campaign to manipulate or pressure Canadian security and intelligence agencies. And from the community's perspective, there has been significant unwarranted activity on that front that we have felt. The more concerning part in 2019, after that, the NZCOP's annual report was all about foreign interference and also Canada's capacity to combat foreign interference. So in that report, there are case studies dealing with Russia and China. And when you're talking about redactions, in those cases, there's redactions and there's a summary of 2 to 3 sentences describing what's the nature of the information that was redacted. So there's a case study of Russian foreign interference, Chinese foreign interference, and then there's a second section that talks about Canadian operations to counter that foreign interference. Throughout that entire report, there's 1/3 section that's completely redacted, and all it says is another country that's targeting foreign interference, Canada for foreign interference. Based off of media reporting from Sam Cooper, I believe in September of last year, who reported on getting access to an unredacted copy, actually outlines that in 2016 and 2017, CSIS had actually been observing an Indian intelligence network that was operating and proliferating itself in Ottawa and in Vancouver with intelligence operatives and developing assets in those areas who are engaging in intimidation.
So thank you, Mr. Singh. We're actually over time. Perhaps another member perhaps the next member can give you time to finish that answer. It's Mr. Chahal for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today to provide testimony on this very important topic that this committee is studying. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Singh, on you made some comments in your opening statement regarding foreign interference, particularly interference in the Conservative leadership race. Do you believe there was Indian interference in the Conservative leadership race?
So I think it's important to note and understand, based on Canadian intelligence's own observations, that India is foreign interference is pervasive at all levels of government and in all parties. So just finishing off that last point, in that 2019 annual report where you're talking about electoral interference, the reporting is that when CSIS wanted to dismantle that intelligence network, the government of Canada actually told CSIS to stand down and not take that action that it wanted to take to dismantle the intelligence network, because it was going to disrupt Canada's intention to export pulses, but also that it would have created complications and potentially kiboshed the Prime Minister's trip to India. So that was a conscious decision that was taken at that time. With regards to foreign interference in the Conservative leadership race, we saw in the NZCOP report in June of this year, I believe it's paragraph 73, that talks about intelligence reporting interference in the Conservative Party's leadership race. And if you go into the exhibits at the Foreign Interference Commission, there's an intelligence assessment by CSIS. I believe it's in October of 2022, that's heavily redacted, that talks about foreign interference, by India in the leadership of a political party which coincides with the Conservative Party's leadership race at that time. Sam Cooper, again, who engaged in media reporting around this time, talks about getting exclusive access to an unredacted copy that goes into detail that India targeted the leadership race of the Conservative Party at that time, particularly by excluding a leadership candidate from the Conservative Party from attending any events that are being held by the Indian diaspora community and the consulate in particular, because that individual had taken policy positions that were contrary to India's interests.
Are you aware of any concerns of financial funding of individuals who ran in that leadership race or in nomination races before or after that?
My
In the
understanding,
Conservative Party of Canada?
my understanding based off of Sam Cooper's reporting is that there are Indian proxies who claimed or were observed to be engaging in illicit funding and buying party memberships to influence the outcome of that leadership race.
Do you believe all parties' leaders have had security clearance and have reviewed the documents, and I believe the bloc leader also has received a security clearance? Do you believe that leaders of Canadian political parties all should get their security clearance, and the only leader that hasn't is Mr. Poilievre of the Conservative Party of Canada? Do you think this is a requirement to be a leader of a political party?
And this is something that was addressed by my colleagues who appeared earlier as well. That is our position that any leader, a federal party leader, or any official who's able to get that access should get security clearance to be able to access the nature of the intelligence that Canadian agencies have about Indian foreign interference, because, as we discussed, it's incredibly pervasive. It's elusive, and it's at all levels of government and in all parties. And the only way to effectively combat that is to increase our situational awareness, increase even public awareness, and I would actually go even further than the security clearance for leaders, but taking active steps to inform the broader public about the nature of Indian interference, because the only way to combat it is if you're actually informed, as well as you possibly can be, to identify and note where those threats exist, so that you can take active steps to counter those and make sure that they're not undermining Canadian institutions or targeting the community.
Mr. Alcock, I'm going to ask you the same question. Do you believe party leaders here in Canada should get their security clearance?
Mr. Chairman, I think there are advantages for a party leader to have a clearance, clearly in managing their own parties and the members of their own party. That is, I think, a necessity, probably. And I certainly would recommend it. Having said that, whether all party leaders require clearance or not is, I'm not sure that that's a necessity.
It was offered to a party leader, they should get it. Mr. Poilievre has not received a security clearance. He is not aware of the actions of his members that security agencies might have information on that could be provided in those documents. Do you think he should get a security clearance?
I can't understand, frankly, Mr. Chairman, why the honourable leader of the opposition would choose not to get a clearance, given that there appears to be information about members of his party. But at the end of the day, I can't read the honourable leader of the opposition's mind, so I don't know why he would choose not to.
Would the reason be because he doesn't want to know the truth of what's in those documents, so he doesn't have to take action of members of the Conservative Party of Canada? Do you think that might be a reason why?
Mr. Chairman, that would just be speculation on my part. I have no contact with the leader of the opposition, so I can't really comment on his motivations one way or the other.
Thank you, Mr. Chahal. Next is Madame Michaud, pour 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Chair. I don't know whether the witnesses are wearing their earpieces because I will be speaking French. I'll begin with Mr. Alcock. In the light of questions that have been put as part of this study, which seems very important to me, I think it's very important and very unfortunate that we're seeing parties make a partisan issues out of it and taking advantage of witnesses' presence to ask whether a party leader should have a security clearance. I think there are far more important questions we could be putting to our witnesses. Mr. Alcock, you said you'd been at the head of CSIS between 1994 and 2004. You did not make an opening statement, so I'd ask you to say a little bit about your experience with CSIS. A number of witnesses have said that interference during elections by criminals and Indian agents in Canada does take place. I don't know how far back it goes, but when you were at CSIS, were you already starting to see this kind of activity? And if so, how do you distinguish it from what's taking place today? Is there more such activity? Are we seeing criminal activity? The RCMP held a press conference to unveil some aspects of an ongoing investigation. That's almost unheard of. So could you please talk a bit about your experience and how things stand today? Is there more such activity, and is it broader?
Mr. Chairman, I think the answer to that question, frankly, is that there is more than there was when I was the director of CSIS. But it would be wrong to say that there was no foreign interference or no evidence of foreign interference. At that time, there was foreign interference. There has always been foreign interference. It is, in effect, a result of our being a country of immigration. There has been foreign interference in many communities across the country over the years for a variety of reasons, either because foreign countries are concerned about the actions of their former citizens, or because they see advantages in taking advantage of their former citizens in Canada. So there are different reasons for countries to engage in foreign interference, but it is not new. It has happened before. It will likely continue well into the future. There are things we need to do about foreign interference. There were actions that we took in that period, and I'm sure the service has also taken actions in some cases to deal with the issues of foreign interference. But clearly it has got worse. It has gotten worse both in respect of the Chinese and clearly in the case of India as well. India has become much more aggressive in recent years than it was in an earlier time, although they were active even when I was the director of the service.
Thank you. I would ask you for more details. Why do you think India is acting more aggressively in Canada? Do you think there's a connection to the resurgence of the Sikh separatist movement? For example, I know that there's a large Indian community in Canada, and it appears that India wants Canada to protect Indian diplomats more than it does Canadian citizens of Indian origin. What are the reasons, in your view, for the more aggressive approach by Indian agents?
I think Mr. Chairman, I think the answer to that question lies really in both in the case of China and India, in the increasing role that both of those countries play in the world, and the greater sway they hold across the world. They have both become much more aggressive in terms of their foreign interference. In the case of India, I think clearly the Modi government and its strong Hindu agenda have been an increasing challenge. I would, however, also make the comment that there is a history in this country of terrorism in a number of communities, and the Sikh community is one of the communities in which there were terrorist elements or extremist elements. And that does cause, as I said earlier, it does cause countries to have concern about the activities of their former citizens. Is any of that activity addressed at this point properly or not? I really can't say, because I no longer see, obviously I don't see secret intelligence, so I have no idea whether in fact there are still extremist activities within the Sikh community in Canada. But that even if there is, none of that would justify the actions that the Indians have taken in the last few years.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you.
Merci, Madame Michaud. Mr. McGregor for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And excuse me, I'd like to echo colleagues and thank both of our witnesses for coming before our committee. Your testimony is quite valuable in dealing with this very sensitive and timely subject. Mr. Alcock, I'd like to start with you. You were quoted last month in an iPolitics article saying that there was no reasonable justification for the leader of the Conservative Party to not pursue a security clearance, especially if it is being offered. We often hear his excuses that he doesn't want to be subjected to a gag order. I personally think that's a red herring and a distraction. Maybe from your perspective and the expertise you've had, could you offer this committee some insight on what does a security clearance allow a federal party leader to do? In terms of caucus management, in terms of ensuring that the sanctity of their own internal political party process is really taken care of. Can you offer some insights on the actions maybe a leader could take?
Mr. Chairman, I can't speak to the exact actions that the Conservative leader, the leader of the opposition, could take.
Any leader, like theoretically, hypothetically, what could they do with that information?
Clearly, Mr. Chairman, that information, once provided, is not information that the leader can provide really to anybody else who is not similarly cleared. Having said that, it can influence their actions and cause them to make choices that they might not otherwise be able to make if they did not have access to the information.
Okay, appreciate that. Mr. Singh, we have learned a lot about how Indian intelligence agencies, how their operations in Canada are often in partnership with criminal organizations. The Bishnoi gang has been one that has been mentioned. I was wondering if you could offer this committee any insights on, what your community has noticed in terms of that relationship. I know we do have to address Indian intelligence activities, but could you maybe provide a little bit more testimony on the organized criminal aspect of that relationship?
So I think at the outset, it's important to understand, as I spoke about at the beginning, that India's objective is to criminalize Sikh advocates for Khalistan or other critics of the Indian government, particularly using this narrative of extremism and terrorism, which has been unsubstantiated and baseless. Based on CSIS's own accounts and their submissions before the Foreign Interference Commission, India does not differentiate between individuals engaged in lawful advocacy, protest, freedom of expression, and those that may be believed to engaging in using force in the pursuit of Khalistan. India tries to use this national security construct to clamp down on political activism, and that's something that's been echoed by the RCMP as well as Global Affairs. And when you bring in this element of organized crime, I think it was very shocking for, I think, a lot of Canadians. But it's important to understand this has been the standard MO of Indian security agencies in using state-sanctioned and facilitated criminals to do their bidding, whether that's to manufacture evidence, whether that's to intimidate folks. And particularly when we talk about disinformation, in the last several years, we've seen a concerted effort by the government of India to try and tar Khalistani activists in the Sikh community with this allegation of being kind of interconnected with organized crime and using gangsters themselves. And in reality, when we look at the case in the US of the attempted assassination of Gurpatwant Singh and what took place here in Canada, India has been using those organized crime networks to do its own bidding. And at the same time, in terms of that disinformation, we've seen and heard from the RCMP that there were a number of homicides that took place in Canada, in addition to the assassination of Bhai Hardeep Singh in June. There was also a murder of an individual named Sukhadul Singh in Winnipeg around that time. When you look at Indian media outlets, they're pretty much, it was plastered on every headline, on every outlet, that Sukhadul Singh was somehow related to Khalistani activism and was killed because he was a political activist. When you actually engage with communities on the ground, there is little to no familiarity who this individual is in the first place. So, and I think this goes to something that CSIS spoke to in front of the Foreign Interference Commission, that India is seeking to increase its cyber capabilities and move beyond just disinformation campaigns to something called cognitive warfare, using neuroscience, technology, and the internet to not just confuse people with wrong information, but is actually to engage in certain forms of aggression that manipulate and shape people's and the public's political opinions, their outlooks, and their behaviors. And so this narrative around organized crime that India alleges against the community, for which there is no basis, and the orchestration of violence, such as the homicide of Sukhadul Singh after trying to paint him as a Khalistani activist, and a number of other individuals within Canada who are designated as so-called terrorists, who in reality don't actually have any interactions with the community.
Great, thank you. That completes the first round. We're on to the second round. I have Mr. Januis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Singh, you had mentioned, and it's been reported elsewhere, that Indian foreign interference networks in Canada have operated for years and were left undeterred as a result of a political choice made by the government not to disrupt those networks. Is it correct that the government had information about these networks as early as 2016? And why did this government choose not to disrupt the activities of these networks?
So, like I had said earlier, this is an institutional problem of successive governments for the past 4 decades. There's been public reporting on this issue since as early as the 1980s about Indian operatives intimidating community members here in Canada, interfering in media reporting, as well as elections over the past 40 years. And
sorry, I'll just admit, my time is tight, and I want to give you the time, but I want to get through a few points. So, in the last 9 years, and I understand this, there's a history here that goes back decades, but specifically that were networks, from what I understand, that were identified by CSIS in 2016, and in 2017, there was a proposal brought to disrupt these networks, and according to reporting we've heard from Sam Cooper, the government chose not to disrupt these networks. Is that correct? Is that consistent with your?
That is correct. When CSIS wanted to dismantle these networks, based on that public reporting about the NZCOP's actual contents, is that the government chose not to actually engage in that action because it would disrupt their export and trade priorities with India, and also potentially jeopardize the Prime Minister's trip to India. And right. I think that gets to the root issue that successive governments have failed to take action against India. I would say one is because looking at a marginalized, visible minority that isn't seen to be, true Canadians, and their interests may not be the interests of the establishment or the state or that political party, but it's also this priority to foreign policy over the domestic harms, and that's something we've seen consistently, and that's been reported by NZCOP as well.
And I appreciate your point about the history. There's also a present that you're describing, though, which is that the government of the day, Liberal government, made a choice, and you've confirmed that choice. They made that choice in 2016 and 2017, and that choice contributed to the continuing ability of these networks to operate. But something changed, and I know there's an institutional history, but something changed significantly when the Prime Minister made a choice about not disrupting these networks, so that the public image effects of what he hoped for from the trip to India would be there. And then as part of that trip, he signed an intelligence sharing agreement with India. And I think you'd agree that the Prime Minister, knowing about these information networks, these interference networks in Canada, choosing to sign that intelligence agreement in spite of what he knew, that changed the dynamic, because that meant a kind of sharing of information between Canadian intelligence and Indian intelligence that didn't exist before. Could you share with us what was your advice to the government at the time about that kind of intelligence sharing system, and what have you seen since have been the effects of that decision by the government?
So the community has been unequivocal since as far back as the 80s that any kind of intelligence and information cooperation or agreements with India are incredibly dangerous and have led to the loss of life potentially in the past, and is continuing to do harm in Punjab and in Canada today. So even in 2018, when that agreement, that cooperation framework was signed, the community was unequivocal and was very resolute that this agreement should not have been signed in the first place, and it should be suspended immediately, particularly given the revelations.
Why then did the Liberals choose to sign it, in your view?
So if you look at particularly that 2018 report by NZCOP, it's heavily redacted, but when you read between the lines, India was significantly pressuring the government of Canada around these security cooperation issues and amplifying this narrative of Sikh extremism. When you read that report, officials from the government and including from the public service are described as having a strong priority to convince India that Canada is taking their concerns seriously, and took a number of steps, including signing that agreement. What I would suggest is to appease India and further foreign policy priorities.
Let me get one more question in. I asked an order paper question to the government if any intelligence sharing between Canada and India contained information about Mr. Najjar. The government refused to answer that question either way. And I was surprised by that. If the answer was no, they could have said no, but they refused to answer the question. What's your reaction to the failure of the government to answer a question about whether intelligence was shared with respect to Mr. Najjar?
It's incredibly concerning, and there needs to be immediate transparency and immediate action to put an end to that agreement and any kind of cooperation that targets political dissidents in Punjab and in Canada. And we have seen evidence of harm coming to individuals in Canada and in Punjab on both sides of these interactions that puts members of the community in harm's way and harms their well-being.
Thank you, Mr. Genuis. I have Mr. Shirai next for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both of you. It's always great to be on this committee and hear some of the great testimony that comes before us. I'll first go to Mr. Alcock. You served as the longest, I think, director of CSIS and served your entire term. And my colleagues already asked the question, but this is a preface, a post question to that. Do you recall any previous party leaders in your years from 94 to 2004 that were offered security clearance and they ever refused to take security clearance?
Mr. Chairman, no, I don't. It's never really come up before, frankly. Nor is there, in my memory, ever been a suggestion that party leaders should have a clearance. This, I think, is generated by the events of the last year or so.
So you never heard anybody deny it if they've ever been offered to see the security clearance, or any other, not even just a party leader, but any other person of significance that has been offered this for information sharing purposes to protect the country, for the safety or security of the country?
In most cases, Mr. Chairman, that offer wouldn't have been made to anybody else. Party leaders have on occasion in the past been briefed, usually not at a highly classified level, but being briefed on both security and defense issues. But I've never, it's never happened in my experience that party leaders, there's never been a suggestion that party leaders should have a clearance. This is, I think, generated by the events of the last year.
And in that regard, there was a suggestion made by the Conservative Party leader that the Prime Minister could just walk over in the chambers to the other side and whisper names of people that might be subject to breaches of security or controlled or infiltrated or influenced by foreign countries. Have you ever heard before top secret evidence being shared in a manner where you walk over and use the protection of the Parliament from prosecution as a tool to pass over information?
Mr. Chairman, no, I haven't, and it would be an odd way, frankly, to do things. The reality is, even if the Prime Minister were to walk across the floor and provide the names of individuals, I'm not sure what the leader of the opposition would be able to do with it, since he would have no evidence to support the listing of the names. So it's really a kind of a silly way to try and achieve anything.
And that would be the same case of giving evidence or showing evidence. It would be a very silly or probably inappropriate method of showing evidence, say, for example, on this Indian involvement in Mr. Nidger's assassination or the other matters before, including the other murders.
Mr. Chairman, my point is that if one were to provide sufficient information for it to be useful, one would be providing a lot of classified information. If you're going to provide a lot of classified information, then you really need to think about whether or not security clearance is required. But if you're only providing a little bit of information, that may not be a challenge, but that little bit of information probably doesn't achieve any of it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Alcock. Mr. Singh, we heard in a presentation you gave earlier as well this week and on the Hill, as well as from news reports, that false information not only is used in India to charge people under the United UAP Act, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, and a lot of times they use Canadian, and they don't source the evidence, but they'll use it that somebody was given money from here. It may be just a transfer of funds to help a family. It may be speech in a gurdwara or a temple or a political stage, and that was used to incarcerate. But we also heard of evidence that India has provided that took a Canadian government employee, a CBSA officer, who was suspended for a very long period of time on absolutely false claims. So do you think after that fact, Canada should share information with India in any regards?
I don't think Canada should have been sharing any information with India in the first place, and nor should Canada accept any information that's coming from India. As very clearly you've laid out the example that you gave and other evidence that we've seen, it leads to not only undermining the integrity of any kind of credible institution, meant to be, whether it's a judiciary or a security agency, it's also leading to harm and very serious risks to members of the community, both in Punjab and in Canada. So with the kind of the information sharing we've seen so far, particularly around that 2018 trip, once the government returned from that India trip and signed that cooperation agreement, we saw very quickly that there was what appeared to be an overcorrection where security and intelligence, the community in Canada, began targeting the community based off of unfounded and unreliable evidence from India. And we've seen a number of impacts, including a Canadian permanent resident from Vancouver that's been incarcerated and harassed by Indian security agencies since approximately 2016, because India and security agencies have been trying to coerce and intimidate him to provide evidence against Hardeep Singh, which was false. Because he refused to cooperate, he hasn't been able to leave the country since then, has been implicated in multiple false cases. And any of those allegations against Hardeep Singh specifically, and others as well, have actually been found to be completely unfounded and have not led to any convictions.
What is the conviction?
Thank you, Mr. Sarai. That does conclude your time. You're actually a little bit over. Madame Michaud, pour 2 minutes et demi.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Singh, when RCMP Commissioner Mike Duhem testified before the committee, he said that in the last year, and I quote, there were a number of situations where people were being bullied, harassed, and there were also instances where a duty to warn had to be put in place. There were credible threats to persons, and in such cases, the person has to be warned that his or her life is in danger. What contacts has your organization had with the RCMP or other security organizations over the last weeks or months? It seems activities have evolved recently that includes activities by Indian agents. What's your relationship with the RCMP? Do you feel safe? Has the RCMP carried out its duty to warn some of your members? And what do you think about the RCMP's public disclosure of details of an ongoing investigation in an effort to reassure Canadians? Were you or some of your members indeed reassured?
So I think there's a number of issues there that I'd like to address. And firstly, when it comes to the duty to warn, I think it's very, very important to note, and RCMP confirmed this when they were cross-examined during the Foreign Interference Commission as well. RCMP will go to a number of individuals within the community, and I believe it's been publicly reported that there's been over a dozen individuals who have been warned of an imminent threat to their life without being provided any information about where that threat is emanating from, and without any resources or supports to actually confront that. So when you're looking at a political activist who's being targeted by a foreign country because of their political opinion and their community leadership, and RCMP is showing them a slip of paper saying that, you know, you're being targeted by another country and your life is at risk. What they're essentially provided then with is the option to disengage from public life, stop exercising their charter rights to engage in the political expression and political activism, or continue to engage in public life and face a risk to their life. When it was put to RCMP, I believe the commissioner's response, and I'm paraphrasing, was roughly saying something to the effect of, it's the individual's choice. So I think that the entire system, particularly with the threats that we're seeing from India, I think the government's response, the lack of resources or supports, I think is shocking to most Canadians and is particularly very concerning and something that needs to be acted upon.
Great, thank you, Mr. Singh. Mr. McGregor for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Singh, the Sikh community in Canada, of course, as you said, they've been aware of Indian intelligence activities for decades now. And, you know, what we've discovered, I'll put that in air quotes, over the last year, you know, I think the Sikh community is finally feeling validated, like we've been trying to tell you of this, and hopefully we're shining a light just on how serious this is. I guess what I wanted to know is, you know, how is the level of foreign interference in Canada, how does that relate to the political temperament in India itself? Like under a Modi-led government, is it a particularly, like, has the level of foreign interference and how malevolent it's been, has it been linked to the political temperament in India? And in terms of how we chart a path forward, because, you know, one way or another, we're going to have to continue having relations with India as a country. Do we have a chance of improving that with a Modi-led government, or do we need to wait until the political climate there changes somewhat? Just any thoughts you can offer on those?
I think that the answer to that question is related to what I was just about to finish saying, is that with the RCMP's announcements, in terms of reassurance, the only reassurance that the community can have in this situation is actual action that ensures the accountability not only of lower level individuals who perpetrated the violence, but those at the highest levels of government that actually directed this in the first place. And I think that touches to your point very nicely, and it's important to understand that this aggressive activity has definitely increased since 2014 and the rise of the Modi-led BJP and the RSS kind of conglomerate that's been active and on a rise in India. And I think you have to understand that Hindu nationalist mindset and its authoritarian approach domestically to completely persecute and target religious minorities, but also to stamp out any political dissent. And I think that Hindu nationalist ideology also informs the foreign policy and the approach and the activities of the Indian government, particularly in some of their foreign policy narratives about India as a Vishav Guru, as the Guru, the enlightener and teacher of the world. That approach to global politics is ingrained in that Hindu nationalist kind of chauvinistic approach. And I think that hubris and that arrogance is part of the reason that India felt that it could get away with this. But I think even more importantly and more concerningly, I think the reason that India felt that they could get away with this is because they feel that Canada, the US, and other countries are trying to actively court India as a part of its global strategy to counter or contain China. And I think in terms of addressing this issue, firstly, like I said, is absolutely accountability of the individuals who directed the violence against this community need to be held accountable. But more importantly, that Canadian policymakers need to reflect on the place of India and the government in this world. having a trade or strategic or military partner that is as volatile and unpredictable as India, that's engaging in extrajudicial assassinations all around the world, not just one-off in Canada, but multiple all around the world, I think is somewhat of an indication of how India also operates domestically. And alongside, I think the flip side of that arrogance is also the simmering and increasing tensions domestically. What you're looking at is a tinderbox of nations that have been imprisoned within the Indian state and within that construct. And those fault lines within that country are bursting at the seams. And I think what the assassinations are also a demonstration of the Indian administration's and regime's desperation to neutralize and eliminate any political threats that it sees from the Sikh political community in actually championing justice and human rights for the entire subcontinent.
Great, thank you. Mr. Erpel for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, for almost a decade now, this government's kind of soft on crime approach, loose border policies has contributed to the fact that organized crime elements in Canada have increased. We've seen highest levels of violence in this country that we've ever seen. Extortion, shootings, arsons. Mr. Alcock, would you agree that criminal environment here in Canada, with much easier to get bail now, lesser sentences in Canada, that it would contribute or maybe create a pathway, make it easier for Indian agents to use criminal activity to carry out that work here?
No, not particularly, Mr. Chairman. I don't think those things are related. I think the Indian interference, I think as the previous witness said, a lot of what we see now in terms of Indian interference is a product of the current Modi government and its ultra-Hindu nationalism. That I think has driven much of what has come to light in the last year or so.
Thank you very much. Mr. Alcock, just wanted to address something. It is true that the CSIS Act allows the government to offer information to any Canadian-specific risks on foreign interference without forcing them to get into a sworn secrecy or controlling what they say. That information can be provided to any Canadian if necessary, if there is risk to Canadians?
Mr. Chairman, the issue of classified information always arises, but to the extent that the service can provide some information to individuals, that has happened in the past, including, I assume, recently.
That information can be provided, and which also includes
the issue of classified information does arise. I mean, there is a limit to what can be provided.
No, you still have 3 minutes, actually. Okay, thank you, Mr. Erpel. Ms. O'Connell for 5 minutes.
Yeah, you want?
Thank you, Chair.
If it's okay with Ms. O'Connell, we can pass on the time.
Let's see what they got.
Mr. Motz.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just briefly to both witnesses, thank you for being here. It was already mentioned, Mr. Alcock, that you had talked about Indian interference is not a new issue, that it's become more pressing concern as of late, as a number of countries have become more aggressive in recent years. As a government, as a country, are we properly positioned with our national security framework to address the emerging aggressive threats of foreign interference in this country? And please, both of you answer. And what do we need to prioritize if we're not?
Mr. Chairman, I think that I can't speak to the level of intelligence that the service has at this point because I obviously don't see that intelligence. So I can't really comment on whether the service has enough coverage to be able to respond to foreign interference. My guess, however, would be that one challenge will be resources. Foreign interference is a consuming task. Terrorism has not gone away, and espionage has increased substantially in the last few years as a number of countries become even more aggressive in terms of conducting intelligence operations in various countries, including Canada. So the challenges of resources are always there. There is a question too of whether, to some extent, in a world of review, the service has become more risk averse in terms of what actions it might take. I can't speak to that. My assumption is that they're doing their job and doing it as well as they can, but they do it within a framework that may not entirely always assist them, and that takes you back again to resources. But having said that, Mr. Chairman, I think certainly the authority that the service has and its ability to operate, those exist. It's really a question of you've got the resources to do it. Years ago, somebody asked me whether, as an intelligence service, we had enough resources. The truth is that no intelligence service ever has enough resources. If you were the old East German Stasi, you had half the country watching the other half of the country, and that probably wasn't enough for the Stasi. That isn't true in Canada, obviously. The resources that the service has are much less than the old East German Stasi would have had. But I'm sure that resources are a challenge in dealing with these issues. Foreign interference is a complicated and difficult area to work in, as both of us have said. The Indians and the Chinese have been much more aggressive in the last few years, so it's more demanding.
Thank you, Mr. Motz. We'll move on
Do
to
I have
Ms.
time to answer the question as well? Is it put to both of us?
Sure. Yeah.
So I'll be quick. I think the response and the concern, I would say and strongly suggest, is that foreign interference is not a security problem per se, and the institutional vulnerabilities and gaps that Canada has is actually a policy issue, and it's primarily that global affairs and the foreign affairs ministry have almost all of the tools to actually combat foreign interference. And so what that leads to is this kind of lopsided approach where foreign policy priorities are consistently prioritized over the actual security and domestic and charter-related concerns and vulnerabilities and attacks that Canadians are facing. So as long as foreign policy priorities dictate, or other partisan interests dictate the response to foreign interference, we're not going to be able to actually respond effectively.
Great. Thank you, Ms. O'Connell, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being here. Mr. Singh, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind. I'm just curious, as a lawyer, as a representative of the Sikh Federation, how does it feel watching your Canadian Parliament, and in particular the official opposition leader, time after time asking questions about a car being stolen, someone receiving bail or parole, things about crime. We heard it here today, our borders, but not a single question about a Sikh member of our community, your community, being murdered. When the RCMP actually came out in quite an extraordinary way, outlining very serious criminal allegations and an investigation that's still ongoing. And they mentioned homicides. Not a single question, lots of questions about cars being stolen, but not a single question about a Canadian community member and member of the Sikh faith being murdered.
And so what I would say to that is, as I just answered, is the response to foreign interference, as long as it is dictated or driven by foreign policy interests or partisan interests, communities like ours will continue to be marginalized and vulnerable and targeted. Foreign interference obviously is not a partisan issue, and on this issue particularly, we lost a loved member of our community who was a father, who was a brother, who was a friend, who was a leader. And I would suggest, and what I would like to emphasize on all sides across the aisle, anybody trying to turn any element of this issue into a partisan issue is incredibly problematic. And it continues to proliferate this feeling amongst the community that we're being used as bargaining chips by political parties domestically and internationally, kind of in terms of geopolitics, that we're being used kind of back and forth between Canada and India. our political aspirations, our safety, security, our dignity are primary, and that should be the primary focus of everybody around the table rather than trying to take partisan cheap shots against each other on both sides.
Thank you. And following up on Mr. Singh's comments about kind of naming, and I want to ask Mr. Alcock this question. The questions around foreign interference, as both witnesses have said, have long existed. And I'm curious about, perhaps, Mr. Alcock, you can speak to the challenge around, and Mr. Singh raised it in his opening statement too, around the naming of, information, or naming and shaming is what some countries do when it comes to some of these activities. And what is that process like, or in your experience? Obviously, you may not have access to the intelligence currently, but that debate around naming of countries and what goes into that process and what are some of the risks?
Mr. Chairman, the issue of actions that are taken to deal with foreign interference, there are a range of actions that can be taken. Some of them are within the control of the service. Some of them are within the control of the police, depending on the nature of foreign interference actions. To some extent, as the previous witness said, as my companion said, there are sometimes decisions taken on the issues of foreign policy, and those decisions are decisions that the government is responsible for and is accountable for. I can't speak to whatever decisions were taken in more recent times, obviously, but generally speaking, in the past, where action has needed to be taken, there has not been a serious issue.
And in that process, one would assume that, based on intelligence, that process is constantly reviewed, and there would be thresholds in terms of at what point, for example, is there a risk to not informing Canadians? And I point to, again, the RCMP's announcement and press conference. I can't imagine that a policy is taken and it doesn't matter what country X does, that it's then never reviewed, and that there is an ongoing process based on intelligence gathering.
I assume there certainly would have been in the past, and I assume that would be true at this point in time. I would make the point that, frankly, although I have seen foreign interference over the years, certainly the last year has been a bit of a challenge in the sense that I have never seen anybody any other country attempt to assassinate Canadians in the past. So we have reached somewhat of a new level in terms of foreign interference when that happens.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Alcock. Thank you, Ms. O'Connell. That does conclude the first hour. To both witnesses, thank you for your testimonies, and thank you for appearing before this study. That concludes this portion of the meeting. We're going to suspend for a few minutes to change panels. Thank you. To order, I'd like to welcome our witness for the second hour from the Center of International Governance Innovation. Aaron Shull is the Managing Director and General Counsel by video conference. I now invite Mr. Shull to make an opening statement of 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Vice Chair, and members of the committee. And thank you for the opportunity to address the critical issue of foreign interference and criminal activities in Canada, specifically by agents of the Government of India. To me, this issue strikes at the heart of our national sovereignty, public safety, and indeed the integrity of our democracy. In my remarks today, I want to help clarify what happened, why it happened, and what I think you can do about it. Number one, what happened? The assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar in June 2023 was a flashpoint in uncovering the extent of foreign interference activities conducted by agents of the Government of India. Through investigations led by the RCMP, supported by CSIS, it became evident that these actions are part of a broader pattern of transnational repression. Indian diplomatic officials in Canada have been implicated in coordinating intelligence gathering efforts and collaborating with criminal networks to intimidate and harm Canadian citizens. The methods include espionage. Indian officials gather intelligence on individuals within the Indo-Canadian community using diplomatic channels and coerced proxies, criminal facilitation. Organized crime groups, such as the Lawrence Bishnoi Gang, have been directed to carry out acts of violence, including assassination plots and intimidation campaigns, and disinformation campaigns. Indian narratives have sought to polarize communities in Canada, labeling lawful advocacy for Sikh rights as extremism, while amplifying propaganda through diaspora-targeted media. This interference, however, is not isolated, believe me. It reflects a deliberate strategy to suppress dissent and manipulate Canadian political and social systems to align with India's interests. Despite multiple diplomatic meetings and law enforcement interventions, the problem has persisted, underscoring the need for stronger and a more coordinated response. Number two, why it happened. India perceives segments of the Canadian Sikh diaspora, particularly those advocating for Khalistani independence, as a direct threat to its national security and territorial integrity. This perception has driven the Indian government to conflate lawful political advocacy with violent extremism, resulting in a systematic campaign of surveillance, intimidation, and violence targeting individuals and communities in Canada. India's actions are fueled by its long-standing internal conflicts and an aggressive foreign policy aimed at silencing dissent abroad. Number three, what I think you can do about it. First, expand CSIS and RCMP resources for counterintelligence operations targeting Indian proxies and agents. Under this, I think you should look at strengthening the threat reduction measures, or TRMs as they're referred to disrupt foreign intelligence networks and prevent imminent threats. Secondly, legislative and policy measures leverage the new tools under Bill C-70, such as production orders and cross-border information collection, to enhance investigations. Continue statutory reviews of intelligence legislation to make sure that you're keeping pace with evolving threats and ensuring flexibility in addressing emerging tactics. Thirdly, community protection and public outreach. I've heard other witnesses talk about the duty to warn. I think you need to maintain timely, transparent warnings for individuals facing credible threats, while also pairing these with robust protective measures, including law enforcement support and safety planning. There'd be nothing quite like getting a notice that you are being targeted for assassination from a foreign state actor without anything else other than the warning. Build resilience within affected diaspora communities through education, direct engagement, public awareness campaigns, ensuring trust in Canadian institutions, and look at addressing the disinformation campaigns by countering narratives spread by Indian state media through coordinated efforts with the Department of Heritage and the CRTC. The fourth area would be the diplomatic and multilateral efforts. So here, coordinating through coalitions like the Five Eyes and bilateral diplomatic channels. But you need to make clear that violations of sovereignty through interference and violence will prompt significant consequence. And you can't just say you have to do it. You have to raise the cost. And the fifth, and this is a new idea that I don't think anyone else will have said, we should look at using speaking indictments. And what I mean by that is this: Canada should follow examples like jurisdictions like the United States, in using speaking indictments to address foreign and expose foreign interference. A speaking indictment is more than a legal document. It's a public accountability tool. It details the evidence behind the criminal charges, outlines the methods and actors involved, and explains the broader context of foreign interference. It creates a clear narrative for the public. It names specific actors, including diplomats, proxies, and criminal networks in an indictment, and it publicizes the risks and consequences for engaging in these activities. As an example, in the United States, the Yukis Yadav superseding indictment effectively exposed the methods and coordination of foreign operations. In Canada, a similar tool could be used to detail India's role in directing and facilitating acts of violence, coercion, disinformation through both state and non-state actors. That superseding indictment read like a spy novel, but no one took issue with it. Everyone, when it was an indictment, it did exactly what it was supposed to do. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Shull. I have Mr. Motz for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witness for participating today. From your position, obviously the Center for International Governance and Innovation, follows these sort of things as a think tank and has a view that many of us don't always have. And so I'd be interested to know from your perspective, is Canada's legislative framework sufficient to and appropriate to properly combat the rising and the more aggressive foreign interference?
So thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. It's a great question, Mr. Motz. And I would say maybe two things. There's one answer that deals with our legislation. And look, there's a bunch of statutory reviews that we're still waiting for. So I think we should start there. But it's also, there's the legislative reviews and the tune-ups that would be required, but also a national security strategy. Because for me, and I appreciate what we're doing here, we're having one single conversation about one single government in one single area. And it was ditto for the Foreign Interference Commission, where we're looking at elections. Of course, it's much broader than that. And so what I would urge is a strategy that looks at the relationship between trade, economic development, intellectual property theft, research support, defense industrial strategy. It's all connected. And so treating them as categorically discrete things, I actually think misses a huge opportunity. And the last thing I'll say is that adversarial states view these areas as strategically linked. And so I think it behooves us to do the same.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to expand on that just a little bit. I know I was very intrigued with our previous witness, Mr. Singh, and his testimony, and he kind of alluded to the fact that sometimes a government needs to put aside our foreign policy for the sake of protecting domestic potential harms. And so when you build a national security strategy, how do you marry those, how do you properly marry those to, of course, every country, we need to have a relationship with our allies, obviously, in other countries, but we also got to keep our citizens safe. How do we do that and develop a national security strategy that is appropriate for a serious of an issue as foreign interference?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a realist and not in the Clausewitzian sense of the word. Obviously, I realize that there's strong states out there and strong states are going to behave in any way that they see fit. And I think we're on the receiving end of a little bit of that right now, where India is flexing its newfound muscle on the global stage, right? And so this is inevitably one of the things that you're going to see. That being said, I think the highest order of government, the highest concern of government is to keep citizens safe. And so if we're talking about a series of counterbalancing trade-offs, it's awfully hard to trade citizen lives for the purposes of a trade deal. And look, I realize that the world's a complicated place, but I would just say this, that if we're going to be doing a strategy and we're going to be looking at what's the first objective in the first sentence of that strategy, it is the highest responsibility of government is to keep Canadian citizens safe, period.
Thank you. And I appreciate that, because I think that is one of the government's first initial responsibilities. Now, does Canada have the capacity to handle the more aggressive foreign interference that we're seeing? Is the current government taking sufficient action on foreign interference? And if not, how can we improve that?
Well, so it's interesting. I mean, the example that I was drawing at when I said we should look at speaking indictments, when that happened in the United States, I mean, you should read how the U.S. treated it. I mean, they caught the guy before he was able to commit the assassination. They deployed a sophisticated undercover apparatus, and then the charging document, it's beautiful. Like this, I mean, I went to law school at Columbia Law, so I know a little bit about the U.S. legal system. This individual's chances of successfully defending that prosecution is about 0%. And so, like, look at the way that it worked in the U.S. They interdicted it before it happened. Look at the way it happened here. Someone lost their life, and now there's an investigation. And so when I'm thinking about the best way to answer your question, I would start to think about the resources of the RCMP and whether or not that institution, as currently constructed, is fit for service, because the 21st century is a lot different than the 20th one. And so what does a modern police force look like that has to deal with everything from sophisticated foreign interference operations to cyber attacks and on and on?
Thank you. I appreciate that. And you almost drew me in to ask a question about the RCMP, but I want to stick with your the statement you made about this speaking indictments. It intrigues me. What you're really saying is the role of government in a situation like this is transparency. And that's really what a speaking indictment is, a transparency document. And, how do we address, the transparency or the lack of transparency that's currently happening, and how this government and how any government could handle foreign interference now and moving forward?
Well, I mean, that's it, right? I watched the press conferences the same as you did when the commissioner was out there. I looked at the previous witnesses' testimony. I've read all the reports. So, but it was, for us, it was like drip, 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 right? The story was revealed slowly. And really, when we first heard about it as Canadians, and look, I'm not security cleared, I'm just some guy, right? So I was watching this on TV like everyone else. It was the story was revealing itself quite slowly, and it was unclear. And I think as a consequence of that, we probably did a bit of a disservice for Canadians because they were having a hard time following the shifting narrative. Whereas in the U.S., it's like you pick up that indictment, you know exactly what the guy did, who he was working with, how he did it. Like there's no room for debate. And so the transparency piece through that mechanism is crystal clear.
Thank you, Mr. Motz.
Thank you, Mr. Scholl.
Mr. Shirai for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Scholl. It's very actually interesting listening to especially the speaking indictments. But you're being a lawyer in the U.S., myself being a lawyer trained in Canada. I think the difference, and I agree with you, the speaking indictment of an American court is pretty appealing because it actually lays out the exact evidence, how it was obtained, what it is, and the general public sees that before a person actually even stands trial. Whereas in Canada, we get the accused gets the disclosure after being usually charged in court, and it's not really made public. It slowly trickles out. This is probably a difference of the Westminster model versus the American model of legal process. But do you think there's ways that can be? I don't know if you're also well versed in Canadian law as well, to give some opinion on how Canadians could do it better without changing our legal system in entirety.
Yeah, no, and for what it's worth, I mean, I did my LLM at Columbia Law. I did my first degree at Ottawa Law, and my very first legal job was actually at the Crown Attorney's Office in Ottawa. So I'm very proud of that as a summer student. So no, I think all it would require is rolling over the information just to add additional particulars, right? And so, and for me, I understand, that we often talk about counterbalancing the rights of the accused. They're innocent before trial and all that type of stuff. I agree. But even in the courtroom, it's an open courtroom. The evidence comes out eventually anyway. All I'm saying is front load your evidentiary claims, just call your shot. This person did this. Here's the evidence that we're going to pretend to rely on. And then it's clear to everyone what happened and what the implications of it are, rather than this shifting narrative. Because if the narrative shifts, hostile states get in there. Like that is that like textbook for growth area for disinformation when you start to see a shifting narrative. So if we can be clear about it, I think it's going to solve two problems for us.
You also mentioned disinformation, and there's a big problem with diaspora communities watching channels that are either aired from India or other China or other places, or they're not really under Canadian CRTC purview. What's the best method of countering disinformation for our Canadian audiences? I mean, we had done it, and I'd asked this the last time, I think, with Russian television, RTTV, under CRTC. It got removed from cable networks. But what are other methods that other states that you might have studied have that are better than what we have currently, or how we can improve on disinformation campaigns by foreign entities?
Yeah, and I think the one distinction I wish to draw here is when we're talking about it, let's be crisp that we're speaking about information operations run by state actors, because normal people have the right to be wrong. You can say pretty much anything you want, right? So leaving aside individuals and the various free speech rights that go along with that, when it comes to state actors, we haven't talked about leaning on the sanctions regime at all. So that was one thing I advocated for a fairly pronounced way when it came to Russia. Make it harder for people, because no one wakes up in the morning out of a sense of civic duty to do disinformation operations, right? People want to get paid for it. So if you can make it harder for them to get paid to run these things, that's great. If it's on TV or whatever, then yeah, you've got the regulatory mechanisms that are available. But to be frank, most of this stuff is social media, and I just advocated for using your intelligence apparatus, finding who what they call the trolls are. So there's bot farms, which are computer programs, and then there's the trolls that run those things. Find the trolls and sanction them. And then to the extent that it's possible, if CSE can use some of its offensive cyber capabilities under Bill C-59, hammer them, try and take them offline. And the NSA did it before the last election, right? So you watch what happened to Russian disinformation. They made it technically more difficult. So there are tools that are available for this. So I would encourage a hard look at those.
You had also mentioned diplomatic, I guess, getting strength diplomatically. And I recall when we had the two Michaels incarcerated in China, one of the hearing dates, I think 16 or 16 plus ambassadors and high commissioners from around the world that were present in Beijing showed up at the hearing to show solidarity with Canada. It might have been more. I might be using a number much lower. But do you think this is the type of solidarity and that beyond the Five Eyes that the West or Western democratically aligned countries around the world need to band together to compel countries like China, India, Russia to not engage in such forms of transnational aggression, and any strategies that other countries might have done that have been effective?
So, I mean, statements I think are important, but they're also cheap, right? They're just words. And so for me, this is about actions. Like the point here, and let's be clear about what we're talking about. You cannot come and kill Canadian citizens. And so there's a cost that's extracted as a consequence of that. And look, owing to diplomatic immunity, and I support diplomatic immunity. There's good reasons under international law why we have that. So we couldn't prosecute. But that does not mean that there should not be a consequence. And so think about trade remedies, think about sanctions, think about working together to punish this behavior. Like there needs to be an actual corporeal, tangible consequence. So statements are great, and I think that's your entry point. But for me, there has to be a significant cost associated with this.
So thank you, Mr. Sarai.
Thank you.
Madame Michaud for 6 minutes.
Ms. Michaud, 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Scholl. Thank you for being with us today. I heard you say a number of things, such as the security of Canadians should be the government's priority. I'm wondering about the government's response so far. I know that the RCMP held a press conference to disclose a number of aspects of the ongoing investigation. There was action targeting diplomats, but there is a significant and economic relationship between Canada and India. And the witnesses who appeared before you were saying Why is there increased interference from some countries? Because those countries are playing an increasingly important role on the world stage. That certainly applies to India. Do you believe the Canadian government's response could be not as strong as we hope because of the economic relationship between India and Canada, which may continue to grow? There seems to be significant potential economically for that to happen. So do you believe that we're to some extent losing sight of Canadian security, which should be the priority over an economic relationship? Is Canada trying to be a nice guy and not anger India? How do you see the relationship, the human and the economic relationship between Canada and India?
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Chair.
Question. And for what it's worth, I'm doing Duolingo. I've been doing it for 81 days straight. So the next time I appear in front of this committee, je vais parler français, j'espère.
Next time I hope to be speaking French. I'm working hard.
So I think the answer is realpolitik, right? And so the answer, unfortunately, is that strong states are going to do what strong states are going to do. And so when they are able to push their way around, that is exactly what you can expect here. And so the question for me is one of what is it that Canada can do to counterbalance that? And I think the answer inevitably is going to involve friends and allies, right? Because India is a much larger country, a much more populous country. And so this is what we're seeing now. And so, and also maybe I'll make another point to say, expect more of this, right? Transactional types of diplomacy and bullying, right? China was doing it, India is doing it, and so I would expect that to continue. So the operative question in my mind is, what do we do to increase Canada's ability to deal with that?
Je vous remercie. Je questionnais tout à l'heure.
Thank you. I was asking the previous witnesses about the RCMP's duty to warn when they're aware of criminal activity, when somebody's life might be in danger. They are obliged to warn that person. Our witnesses from the Sikh community were saying that the duty to warn people who might have their lives threatened is all very well, but at the same time, it's not accompanied by any tangible action. There's no support. And those people aren't offered any kind of security. What would you think? Would it take more resources for our agencies to provide that kind of security? Could it be part of the solution? It wouldn't solve the whole problem, but it would help people who've been targeted to feel safer. They also, do you condemn what they condemned? I mean.
So thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. Like the previous witnesses, I would be in favor of enhanced security measures where they're warranted. So where threats are severe, providing personal protective security measures such as police escorts, temporary relocation, or surveillance systems. But for me also, and not to be overly calculated about it, but it's a 2-for-1. The first is you get to save people's lives, right? You get to protect people when they are at their most vulnerable. And so for me, I think that is just the right thing to do, just as a matter of moral obligation, to say nothing of a legal one. But it's also, there's a second benefit, which is that by virtue of doing that, by virtue of behaving that way, you're showing that you are a trusted institution that can be counted upon to do the right thing. And so part of this, the solution to this, goes to trusted and effective and deep and meaningful relationships in those communities, right? And so if people feel like they're on their own at the worst possible moment when they're the most vulnerable, that doesn't inspire a whole lot of trust. But if you're able to show that during severe times of strain and stress and danger that you're able to provide personal protection and security measures, then I think that's actually going to help you in those communities as well too. So it's, for me, it's actually, there's two benefits.
Great, thank you. Mr.
merci.
McGregor? Mr. McGregor for 6 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome back to our committee, Mr. Shull. Thanks for being here and helping us with this particular study. We know that, like as you said in your opening statement, India does see a lot of these separatist movements around the world as sort of a direct threat to its national security. That's its perception, and we know, in its internal politics, a lot of minority groups, minority religious groups, are not having an easy time, for lack of a better term, under the current political government, the Modi government. But I'm just, looking at, its overall strategic objectives, India's overall strategic objectives, and using this sort of heavy-handed approach of, partnering with organized crime, using blackmail, death threats, coercion, and of course, outright murder. I'm just wondering, do you think, like, India has kind of overstepped itself now? Like, is the bad press it's getting now internationally, because this made the news worldwide? I mean, when the Prime Minister stood in the House of Commons last year in September and used ministerial statements to name India, and then, of course, we have had a whole series of reports come out since then. Has India sort of ruined its strategic objectives by now being suddenly put in the limelight?
It depends on what their strategic objectives are. And so I'll back up a step and say, this has harmed their reputation amongst real democratic nations for sure. But I think what it is, and inevitably you see this from time and time again, is states putting their short-term interests in front of long-term geostrategic stability. So they are playing checkers when they should be playing chess. And here's what I mean by that. They're now seen as a bit of a pariah. And so if you can say the words Russia, China, India, North Korea in the same sentence, and you're like, oh yeah, that kind of fits. Like, if that's your club, if that's who you're hanging out with, what does that say about you, right? And so for me, democracy is actually two things. Not to turn this into a political science lesson here, but it's a process. You get to vote, and the votes get tallied, and whoever gets the most votes in some fashion wins. A process. It's also an outcome, a pluralistic society built on the rule of law. And I think that's the erosion that we're seeing here. And so, yeah, if you can be lumped in with the North Koreas of the world in the same sentence, your brand is not doing good. But the fact that they are traveling as a herd now also should give us pause in the Western world, right? So this is the geostrategic reality that we're part of now.
On that subject, I mean, of course, every country has its national interest, and our allies are no exception. And I know that, in recent years, stronger relations with India was seen as a way to counteract China's growing influence in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, our allies have, we had testimony from one of the deputy ministers from Foreign Affairs. They're quite satisfied that our allies are standing with us on these very serious allegations. But of course, our allies have their own strategic objectives as well. Like, how do you see this playing out in the coming years? Because I know, many of our allies also have a deep desire to forge stronger relationships with India. There's great economic potential there, and so on.
Yeah, well, there's that old saying, right? Countries don't have friends, they have interests. And so this is and I think, a part of it is there's like political culture in Canada where we haven't really paid attention because we haven't really had to, right? We've had the United States, so we're safe. We've had access to the U.S. market, so we're rich, and it just hasn't really required us to think about the world that way, right? But the fact is that's the way it is, and believe me, when the new U.S. administration gets in there, like, buckle up for that as well. And so countries have interests. The question is, how does Canada leverage its position, its strategic position, to maximize our interests vis-a-vis what we see going on in the world, right? And so, so that's the way that I would start to position this conversation. And maybe I won't get into the strategy that I pursue right here, but the next time we have a chat, I can maybe think a little bit about the way that I would do it based on the way I'm seeing the world.
And you had some suggestions. You talked about how we need to greatly expand our counterintelligence capabilities of the RCMP and CSIS, really maximize the new tools that we have, such as Bill C-70. But just turning to the political realm, I mean, we know that India and other countries are very, they have a desire to influence our politics. So outside of the things I just mentioned, like, what do you think political parties should be doing? Any recommendations you want our committee to focus on?
Yeah, I think, this idea of having every member of parliament briefed when there's a new session for real, like a deep and meaningful brief, I think would be helpful. The other thing, and I've mentioned this in another committee to think about, and there's precedent for it, there used to be a per vote subsidy for parties. I think we should bring a subsidy back so that each party can hire a national security advisor, someone who's cleared, who's within the party, who looks at it from a political lens, but has the necessary clearances. Because there's a book called Political Tribalism by Amy Chua, and it's just a matter of human psychology that people are more likely to believe or listen to folks that come from their own party and someone who understands the political lay of the land. So having a dedicated asset and resource in the party, I think, would be another thing to think about. So briefings across the board, a dedicated asset, and then for what it's worth, encourage your staff to come to the lunch and learn session that I'm hosting once in a while to be educated on national security matters. I've joked, come for the turkey sandwich and stay for a lecture about what CSIS does.
Great, thank you. Ms. Stancher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I wish to move the following motion. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, given that Canadians continue to be affected by geopolitical impacts of the October 7th, 2023 attacks by Hamas on Israel, and given that recent court filings have revealed disturbing details about a thwarted ISIS-linked bomb plot targeting Jewish Canadians on Parliament Hill, and given that an anti-Semitic riot occurred in Montreal on November 22nd, 2024, the committee immediately prioritized a study to run concurrently with the study on border security agreed to on Thursday, November 21st, 2024, to investigate the dramatic rise in terrorist plots and acts of violence targeting Canada's Jewish community, including the thwarted terror attack on Parliament Hill, that the study be comprised of no less than 8 meetings, and that the committee invite 1, the Minister of Public Safety and the Minister of Immigration on the matter of the motion passed on Thursday, September 19th, 2024, a special advisor on the Jewish community, relations and anti-Semitism to the Prime Minister, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Commissioner, Brigitte Gauvin, the RCMP Deputy Commissioner for National Security, representatives of the RCMP's Federal Policing Integrated National Security Enforcement Team, Robert Burley, Executive Director of the Canada Centre for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence, Director of CSIS and other law enforcement officials, Director of Parliamentary Protective Services, recognized experts in national security, and representatives from TikTok, X, Snapchat, Discord, Reddit, Facebook, Telegram, Minecraft, and Roblox, civil society and academic organizations, including the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs and B'nai B'rith, to discuss the foiled terrorist plot, the rise of violent anti-Semitism, and recent measures the federal government has undertaken to address it, and the role that social media and gaming platforms play in radicalizing youth and mobilizing violence, and that the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House, and pursuant to Standing Order 109, the government table a response to the report. Mr. Chair, as you know, Conservatives have made multiple attempts to bring forward a motion, and we wanted to bring forward this one in this format, considering what Ms. Demoff had put forward. It includes a number of the witnesses we know are important to Liberal members. It seems that there is an interest by all parties to study this, although I do want to make the point that the focus of anti-Semitism has to be the focus of this study, and if we look at what the Jewish community has faced over the past 13 months. I'm sure the committee would agree. Certainly, there's been a 109% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in 2023 compared to the previous year. For the most recent data available, there's nearly 6,000 documented acts of violence, harassment, and vandalism aimed at Jews in Canada in 2023. And in 2024, there were 66% of hate crimes with religion as a motivation were targeted at Jewish Canadians. Again, Jewish Canadians make up only 1% of all of Canada's population, so incredibly significant. There were 16 anti-Semitic incidents occurring every single day for the data available in 2023. And as we know, in November 2023, in Montreal, 2 Jewish institutions were firebombed exactly 1 month after the October 7th attacks in Israel. Also, in November 2023, 2 Jewish schools were shot up with gunfire, and notably they were an elementary and a kindergarten school. And then twice in 2024, a Jewish girls' school in North York was subject to gunfire. In May 2024, there was an arson attack on a synagogue, and we know synagogues have, by and large, across the country experienced an increase in vandalism. August 2024, across Canada, 100 Jewish institutions received bomb threats. And certainly we know at this committee there's been multiple thwarted terrorist plots to massacre the Jewish people, notably on Parliament Hill. We recently found out that in December 2023, 2 teens were plotting to bomb Parliament Hill, again, the heart of our democracy. There were a number of people from the Jewish community there, a number of members of parliaments from all parties. And certainly we also had heard at this committee about the individual with a student visa who was en route to Brooklyn, New York earlier this fall to commit a massacre against the Jewish people. And we also heard reports and concerns that the father-son duo that were planning to make an attack in Toronto this past summer may have been targeting the Jewish community. So multiple thwarted terrorist attacks on the Jewish community. And of course, we have all seen the protests targeting Jewish businesses, elderly care homes, and most recently the riots in Montreal where someone called for the final solution on the Jewish people. And I just want to conclude with my remarks, Mr. Chair, that we are considering a lot of important matters at this committee. There are a lot of competing interests, but certainly I think it's very evident that the Jewish community has faced something in the past 13 months that few of us could understand unless they're Jewish. The trauma from October 7th is felt continuously, particularly by women in the Jewish community in Canada. And ultimately, I do feel that the Jewish community feels that they've been abandoned both by their government and others. And I think it's an important signal for the Committee of Public Safety and National Security to send to the Jewish community that we have their backs, that we're going to take this seriously, that we're going to study this, and really send a signal that we care about this and we are taking it seriously as a committee. And I'll just conclude by saying, I believe we have 4 more meetings on India. So I would ask Mr. Chair that I know we're starting Ms. Michaud's study as well, that we look at, as I mentioned, concurrently looking at that with this study, and that we at least have 1 meeting on this before Christmas. I think that really, or before the holidays, I think that would send the right signal to the Jewish community and those that wish to harm them. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Sancho. I think if the committee is okay with it, we can let Mr. Shull go. Mr. Shull, thank you so much for your testimony today.
Thanks, everybody. Nice to see you.
And then I have Ms. Damoff as the next speaker.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to Ms. Dancho for bringing this forward today. I also want to thank the Conservatives for including some of the witnesses that we had proposed. Mr. Lloyd, thank you for I had sent you some information on the social media and gaming platforms, so I'm appreciative that you reviewed them and it's included in this motion. So I do have an amendment, not a lot, to make to this this motion that Ms. Dancho has just brought forward. I will make a comment that I understand the Justice Committee did do a study on anti-Semitism, which has not been tabled yet. It would be helpful for us, I think, to have access to that report before we start our own study at Public Safety. So I'll read it right now. The changes that I have. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, given that Canadians continue to be affected by the geopolitical impacts of the October 7th, 2023 attack by Hamas on Israel, and given the recent court filings that revealed the disturbing details about a thwarted ISIS-linked bomb plot targeting Jewish Canadians on Parliament Hill, And given that an anti-Semitic riot occurred in Montreal on November 22nd, 2024, the committee study the growing trend of violent extremism, in particular the increase in youth involvement, the rise in foiled terrorist plots and acts of violence targeting Canada's Jewish community, including the thwarted terrorist attack on Parliament Hill, that the study be comprised of no less than 4 meetings, and that the committee invite. I'm not going to read all of the witnesses again, but I would point out that we have changed witness number 2 and deleted what is there and inserted Canada's Special Envoy on Preserving Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Anti-Semitism. And then in the last paragraph, the rest of the witnesses remain the same. To discuss the foiled terrorist plot, the rise of violent extremism, including anti-Semitism, and the rest of the motion stays the same, Chair. So I believe it's been sent electronically, and I would put that amendment forward.
We did in.
Thank you. Just trying to write this down, but I believe, if I'm correct, it's removed sort of the priority, the part where it says the committee immediately prioritizes study. Okay, and then it cuts it down from 8 meetings to 4, and it expands it beyond only violent anti-Semitism to violent extremism with a focus on, or with, I don't know if you said the word focus, but with a emphasis perhaps on anti-Semitism, but it's been expanded beyond that. So if Ms. Demoff can just confirm that my 3 points are correct, and then I would just like to respond.
We'll just wait for the clerk to distribute the amended motion.
Thank you. So I appreciate the amendment, but I would say I think removing, we have moved a number of studies that we seem to have that are not being pursued, so that are sort of just thrown in the heap with the rest, and we haven't got to them. And so my concern with removing the priority mention is that that's going to happen to this one, that everyone can vote in favor of this and feel good about it, but then it's not going to be prioritized by the committee. And I'll note that the Bloc had moved their motion, we approved it, and all of a sudden it's on the agenda, whereas there's been other motions that Conservatives brought forward that have been sidelined despite apparent approval at this committee. And so my concern is that's going to happen with this one if there isn't an immediate priority put on them. And again, Mr. Chair, I made the case that I think we should at very least commit to 1 meeting on this to start the study before the holidays. So I'm not sure if that is the Liberal intention or not, but that would influence how we proceed on this amendment. If I can get that commitment, I suppose.
No.
I would just say when I spoke and when I introduced the amendment, the Justice Committee has done a study on this, and we haven't seen that yet. I think Mr. McGregor was part of that study, if I'm not mistaken. It's not like the government has not, or Parliament, I should say, has not been studying this issue. So I'm quite comfortable leaving this amendment as I've tabled it, Chair.
Thank you. Again, I don't believe the Justice Committee had a focus on the terrorist plots or certainly the rioting in Montreal. And given these are squarely the responsibility of public safety and national security, I think it's imperative that we focus on this. And again, I think it sends a message that the Public Safety and National Security Committee has not done anything on this at all. Given the terrorist plots and given the escalation of what were protests and are becoming riots, I couldn't support something that's going to put this off. And we well know in this committee that it could take years, if ever, for a report to come out. So again, that's just, from my perspective, veiled language of just saying we'll put this off. There's no guarantee that report's going to come out. None at all. And members of the Liberal Party are well aware of that. So that's just not something we could support since that report may never come out. So again, if we can get a commitment to start the study reasonably, at least 1 meeting before then, I think we can move forward.
Mr. McGregor.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, I just want to get on the record as someone who signed the original 1064 letter calling for an emergency meeting on this subject. I do believe it's important. But in terms of how we schedule stuff, over the last number of weeks, we have had 3 proposals from the Conservatives, including this one. A couple of weeks ago, we were debating a programming motion that would have looked at the rise in violence against women and also looking at the intersection between public safety and mental health. Last week in the House of Commons, there was an attempt to get the firearms study referred back to this committee as a priority, and now we're trying to establish this as a priority. So, they're all good ideas. I'm not criticizing them, but I think what's needed, Mr. Chair, is maybe offline or a subcommittee meeting. We need to kind of figure out the calendar. I think Ms. Dancho has expressed frustration on this, that we've got all these great ideas on the table and we've said yes to a number of them, but it can be a bit frustrating, and I share her frustration at times where we're not quite sure how we're making decisions on what studies coming forward. Now, for me, I attach a lot of importance to our current India study. I'm the person who brought forward the motion, after all, to get it started, and I think a lot of people in Canada are very interested in that. So, I'm always a fan of trying to get current business complete, but I think there's room here to possibly get one meeting in on this subject. I'm not sure, but I'm not sure because we haven't yet had those fulsome discussions on how we organize our calendar. So that's just something for us as a committee to collectively think about.
Thank you. So I think from my look at the calendar, we have 5 meetings before we break. I'm also a fan of completing what's on the docket, although obviously I understand that important issues do arise. I recognize Ms. Michaud. Madame Michaud.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not against the motion. My only concern is that Justice seems to have conducted a similar study that took a lot of time and was filibustered both by the Conservatives and the government. We're dealing with very important issues here, interference in elections by Indian agents, Russian interference. So I don't know what the purpose of this motion is, but if it's to achieve the same end as Justice, I don't see why it would be really relevant. I think the government's amendment to reduce the number of meetings to 4 seems more reasonable. Ms. Dancho has a list of witnesses which the government had proposed in previous meetings. It's natural that for a border study, the Bloc Québécois also had proposals to make. We wanted that to take priority over other studies. And Mr. Chairman, you indicated there are 5 minutes left before we rise for the holidays. What does the agenda look like between now and then? Will we be able to begin the border study? If not, I don't see any problem with voting for the amendment and the motion is amended. Thank you.
Thank you, Madame Michaud. So on Tuesday, the minister is appearing. On Thursday, we have a summons for Patrick Brown that will go out. We actually had invited the ambassadors for your study. We haven't received a response yet. That's been the issue. So once we have that response, we should be able to get in at least that meeting with the ambassadors before we rise for the break. And that's sort of where we are right now. But we're already over time, to be honest. If we can get a vote in, I think we should do the vote. If we're going to have a discussion, then the meeting is over. Mr. Motz?
If I could, I think we have to really accept the gravity of what happened on Parliament. This is Parliament Hill. We had a bomb plot on Parliament Hill. And the seriousness of that, and the Canadian public's perception of that, and then the role of this committee on not examining that. And I mean, this is supposed to be the heart of democracy in this country, and yet it doesn't seem to be taken seriously by this current government, unfortunately. And Canadians feel that this is an important issue. I have constituents who were outraged at this whole what was happening here. So whether we have 4 meetings or 8 meetings, we need to have some meetings. We need to give this some attention. And at least I'm sure our study will not be the same as the justice study, right? It'll be different. And I think that's good. I think there's going to be parts of it that might overlap. But we can't just brush this off and hope that it goes away. And we certainly need to at least show good faith that we are starting this process before we break for the holiday season, and then bring this back along with some of the other studies that are important as well. And so I just think that there's a will, there's a way. And let's just exercise some will to make this happen.
Ms. O'Connell?
Since we're out of resources, I move to adjourn.
There's a motion to adjourn. Are we good with that? Sorry? We've made the request. We have a couple minutes, but we'll know in the next 5 minutes whether we have additional resources and for how long. I am aware that it's Thursday and folks have flights out as well. So,
A point of order, Mr. Chair.
There's a point of order for Mr. Chahal.
Yes, I believe that's a dilatory motion that Ms. O'Connell brought forward, so we have to proceed to a vote.
So we have to proceed to a vote.
Ms. O'Connell,
Yes.
Ms. Damoff,
Yes.
Mr. Callaway,
Yes.
Mr. Charles,
Yes.
Mr. Sarai,
Oui.
Ms. Dancho,
No.
Mr. Lloyd,
No.
Mr. Shipley,
No.
Mr. Motz,
No.
Madame Michaud,
En faveur.
Mr. McGregor.
No.
So 6 yeas in favor, 5 nays.
Yeah. So the motion passes. Meeting adjourned.